Have you ever wondered what became of the black musicians who made America erupt in the 60s and 70s? They weren't just electrifying voices under the spotlight, they were the masterminds behind the melodies, the architects of songs that shook arenas and stirred millions of souls. They soared to the summit, selling millions of records, crowned as legends, then vanished, almost as if the world had imagined them. Some were found sleeping in rusted-out vans, others gripping torn contracts, outraged that the rights to their own creations had slipped through their fingers. Was it simply the ruthless machinery of Hollywood? Or were there unseen forces quietly pushing them into the shadows? This is the story of 21 black artists who gave their youth to score an era, only to be erased without mercy. What truly happened to them may leave you stunned. Florence Ballard. Florence Ballard, the Supremes' castaway. Florence was exiled with a colder kind of cruelty. When she stood beside the Supremes, she was their pulse, the powerhouse with a thunderous voice and a songwriter's instinct, who helped lift three girls from Detroit into the greatest female group of the 1960s. When Where Did Our Love Go soared to #1 on the Billboard charts in 1964, Florence believed it was only the dawn. But behind the stage lights, shadows gathered. At 16, she survived a rape that carved a wound too deep for applause to drown out. As fame blossomed, she drank in silence, trying to quiet the shame and the growing tension within the group. Diana Ross became Berry Gordy's chosen centerpiece. Florence felt herself fading, her vocals trimmed, her presence minimized, her name slowly erased from contracts and posters. On June 29, 1967, after a show at the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, Florence locked herself in the dressing room for nearly 7 hours. She drained half a bottle of whiskey, then rose in fury, ripping a Supremes poster from the wall and shattering the mirror with her microphone. "They took everything from me," she screamed, hurling her broken heels into the corner before collapsing in tears. Those who witnessed it said she looked shattered beyond control. Days later, Motown fired her, citing discipline issues and psychological instability. Just like that, she disappeared from the spotlight for nearly 8 years. Florence lived in a small apartment on Buena Vista Street in Detroit with her 3 children and a pile of unpaid bills. Her husband, Thomas Chapman, offered no refuge, only more pain, pushing her deeper into alcohol and despair. In 1971, she walked into a worn-down bar on Linwood Street clutching a broken microphone, whispering, "I'll tell everything." But she never did. The bartender remembers her eyes, the hollow stare of someone who knew she had lost it all. On February 22, 1976, Florence Ballard died of coronary artery thrombosis at just 32. Only a few dozen mourners stood at her funeral. No Motown executive came. And even now, people still ask the aching question. If someone had truly helped her, if someone had loved her at the right moment, would that brilliant flower have faded so soon? Sly Stone. Sly Stone, the funk visionary, betrayed and broken, one of the most tragic disappearances in black music history. Few downfalls were as bitter as his. He wasn't just funk's brightest star, he was a once-in-a-generation songwriter and producer who penned the anthems that set a generation on fire. Behind the studio glass, he worked through endless nights, sculpting every bass line, every lyric, rewriting them again and again until they bled perfection. That man in the white fur coat and dark shades didn't just perform. He invented a sound the world had never heard, a sound that cried out, "We are all people," to arenas packed with thunderous fans. At the height of it all, everyone believed Sly Stone was untouchable, destined for lifelong wealth and power. He wasn't merely the voice at the mic, he was the architect of the greatest funk empire of the 70s. But when the applause faded, the after-parties and the stimulants began tearing him apart. At first, the drugs were a crutch to survive the grind of back-to-back shows. Soon, he couldn't function without them. In late 1979, witnesses say he stormed into a Los Angeles studio, face swollen, eyes blazing. In a burst of fury, he slammed a Fender guitar to the floor and stomped it into splinters, wood shards flying as the room stood frozen in shock. Days later, whispers spread through the industry. Sly had been swindled. A manager had tricked him into signing away the rights to his entire catalog. The music he'd poured his youth into, for less than $50,000. The same songs generating millions in royalties every year. On January 4, 1980, a studio tech found him curled on a hallway bench, clutching the crumpled contract, lips pale as he muttered, "I lost everything. All $20 million. Nothing left." Many believe that betrayal shattered whatever fight he had remaining. After that night, Sly Stone disappeared. For years, no one knew if he was alive or gone. Rumors surfaced of a rusted white van parked along a California highway, of a man inside with matted hair and clothes sour with neglect, calling himself a breathing ghost. It wasn't until 2010 that reporters finally found him there, hunched in silence, eyes hollow. When asked if he would ever return to the stage, Sly gave a faint, weary smile. "I have nothing left to sing to them." And so, the genius who once made all of America dance slowly faded away. Into silence, into poverty, into legend. Betty Davis. Betty Davis. The funk queen who vanished for being too rebellious. Anyone who came of age in the 70s will never forget that night in the fall of 1975. New York stood frozen as Betty Davis stepped onto the stage in a skin-tight silver bodysuit. No bra. Her hair blazing like fire. Before she sang a single note, she turned her back to the crowd, pulled the mic close, and said, "I don't belong to anyone. Not even you." The room exploded, cheers colliding with boos. From that moment on, Betty Davis became the fiercest symbol of feminist funk. Her 1974 album They Say I'm Different launched her into the stratosphere. That raspy, dangerous voice. Lyrics raw with desire and freedom for black women. She didn't just shake the industry, she threatened it. And for many conservative radio stations, that boldness made her an enemy. Soon, DJs across the American South announced a permanent ban on her music. In 1975, Atlanta's biggest station was spinning, "If I'm in luck I might get picked up." Midway through the track, the program director burst into the booth, yanked the vinyl off the turntable, and smashed it on the floor. Then he went live, voice shaking with fury. Betty Davis is a disgrace to black music. She's the devil teaching our daughters how to live in sin. Newspapers piled on, branding her a call girl with a microphone. Record stores pulled her albums from the shelves. Covers were ripped apart and tossed onto sidewalks like trash. Betty fought back. But every show became a battlefield. Every stage meant facing a crowd split between worship and hatred. The exhaustion. The anger. The isolation. Bit by bit, they gnawed at whatever strength she had left. By the late 70s, the pressure, rumors, boycotts, whispers, left her hollow. After Nasty Gal in 1979, she vanished. No tours. No interviews. No explanations. Some said she fell into deep depression, locking herself inside her apartment for months. Others claimed she spent nearly a decade in a psychiatric facility in Pennsylvania, rumors she never confirmed or denied. One chilling story came from a postal worker. In the winter of 1983, he delivered a package to her Pittsburgh apartment. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was cold. Betty sat motionless on a couch, staring out the window, surrounded by stacks of broken records, like a graveyard of her own legacy. They said she had just burned all her old contracts. After nearly 30 years of silence, Betty Davis resurfaced in the early 2000s. But she no longer wanted the stage. She chose a quiet life until her death in 2022. To this day, no one truly knows why the woman who once shouted into the darkness, "I don't belong to anyone," walked away from every spotlight. Maybe disappearing was her final act of freedom. Bobby DeBarge. Bobby DeBarge, the falsetto angel who seemed sentenced long before the bars ever closed around him. Have you ever heard a voice so pure it could hush a crowded room in seconds, and then wondered how something that powerful could simply disappear? Bobby was the heart and soul of Switch, the man behind There'll Never Be. A promise in song that felt like it would last forever. In 1978, when the record soared into Billboard's R&B Top 10, Bobby was just 22. He stood beneath the stage lights, long hair falling over his shoulders, smiling with the bright, unshaken pride of a young star who believed the world was finally opening for him. Motown was ready. By early 1980, they were preparing to press hundreds of thousands of albums. His future looked untouchable. But just as the spotlight burned brightest, shadows began to creep in. By March of that year, whispers moved through Detroit studios that after midnight sessions, Bobby was injecting drugs between takes. Soon, no performance passed without him slipping away, locking himself in a bathroom stall, chasing calm in lines of deadly white powder. Then the fall came fast. On August 14, 1985, police arrested Bobby in a Grand Rapids hotel parking lot as he handed off a bag of cocaine. The next morning's headline blazed, "Switch star caught in drug mire." Within days, contracts were severed. Tours vanished. The new album, frozen in silence. Prison walls closed in. And inside them came the verdict that felt final. Bobby's HIV test results landed in his trembling hands. A fellow inmate would later remember that night. Bobby sitting alone on a wooden bench in a Michigan prison, staring at the paper as if it were written in fire. He whispered just one sentence, so soft others had to lean closer to hear. "I've been killing myself for a long time." When he was released in 1989, there was no stage waiting. No spotlight. Only a world that had moved on. On the rare occasions he appeared in public, people saw a hollowed face, eyes dimmed of their old fire. On August 16, 1995, in a small hospital in Grand Rapids, Bobby DeBarge took his final breath. He was only 39. Some still say that voice, that once heavenly falsetto, was never meant to find peace. As if life itself had written his fade out long before the music stopped. Linda Jones. Linda Jones, the voice that slipped away in mid-song. To this day, people still whisper about the night of May 12, 1970. The theater in Philadelphia was packed, the air electric. Linda stepped to the microphone and sang the opening line of Hypnotized. Just seconds in, she stopped. Her eyes widened, distant and hollow. Then she crumpled to the stage as the crowd erupted in panic. No one realized this wasn't stage fright or emotion overwhelming her. It was diabetes pulling her to the brink of a coma for the very first time. Before that night, Linda had been crowned the new Queen of Soul. In 1967, Hypnotized soared into the Billboard R&B Top 10, transforming a 23-year-old girl from Newark into a star whose voice ruled the Eastern airwaves. But behind the spotlight, she carried a quiet fear. After every performance, Linda slipped a small jar of glucose tablets into her pocket, protection against the hypoglycemia that could strike without warning. Her condition worsened. Between 1969 and 1971, she canceled show after show, contract after contract. Friends said there were nights she lay awake, terrified she might fall asleep and never open her eyes again. One evening, a friend stopped by and found her sitting on the edge of her bed, clutching a notebook filled with unfinished song titles she hadn't yet recorded. Tears fell silently onto the page, blurring dreams that might never be sung. On March 14, 1972, Linda and her mother walked into a New York studio to record one final song. Her mother later said her voice was so fragile it sounded more like breath than music. When the take was over, Linda smiled faintly and whispered that she felt like she was floating. 10 minutes later, her mother returned to find her resting, eyes closed, breathing shallow and fading. That night, Linda Jones never woke up. She was only 27. And the voice that once hypnotized the world was left forever unfinished. Major Lance, the last dance of a lost soul. Anyone who stood on that suffocating summer night in 1978 never forgot what they saw. Major Lance sat behind the wheel of a black Cadillac, the driver's door hanging open, both hands lifted in the red wash of a patrol car's lights, murmuring as if humming to a song only he could hear. In that instant, the blinding glow of stage lights vanished, and all that remained was a desperate man with nothing left to cling to. In his prime, Major was Chicago soul's golden boy. The Monkey Time burst through the airwaves in 1963, transforming him into the slim young star with the velvet voice who packed dance halls wall to wall. He once said that song taught America how to move. But while the spotlight dazzled, time kept turning. As funk and disco took over, the cheers faded, and Major found himself drifting behind the rhythm of a changing world. By the late 70s, bookings had thinned, barely sustaining his extravagant habits. Like so many before him, he slipped into the grip of cocaine, a silent undertow that pulled him further from shore. On July 14, 1978, police stopped his car on Roosevelt Road. In the trunk, they discovered more than half a kilo of white powder wrapped in a handkerchief stitched with the initials ML. The headlines hit Chicago like a hammer blow. Radio stations pulled his records. Clubs that once welcomed him shut their doors for good. When he was released in 1980, Major moved through the city like a ghost of his former self. One autumn evening in 1983, witnesses saw him standing beneath the faded marquee of the Regal Theater, clutching a black and white photo of himself at 24. He stared at that worn sign as if searching for a doorway back to a home that no longer existed. He passed away quietly on September 3, 1994, after years of fighting heart disease. The voice that once made an entire city sway fell silent at last, leaving behind the echo of a rhythm and a sorrow that never quite fades. Philippe Wynne. Philippe Wynne, a casualty of an internal war. Few could have imagined that the man who once sent America into a frenzy with Rubber Band Man would fade from the summit of music so quietly and so bitterly. When Philippe Wynne, the magnetic lead singer of the Spinners, walked away in 1977, he stepped off the grand stage for the last time, never reclaiming the glory that once seemed untouchable. In their prime, the Spinners were the crown jewel of American soul, and Philippe was hailed as the heartbeat, the fire in their sound. But beneath the velvet harmonies and chart-topping smiles, tension simmered. In March 1977, inside a Detroit studio thick with cigarette smoke and ego, a colleague witnessed the breaking point. Philippe had just laid down vocals on a new track when the manager entered, casually sliding a royalty contract into his hands. He scanned the page. His jaw tightened. His voice, rough with disbelief, cut through the room. "This is all I'm worth to you?" Without waiting for a reply, he hurled the papers to the floor, kicked his chair back, and shouted into the stunned silence, "You've been feeding off my voice long enough." Weeks later, he was gone. From that moment on, Philippe Wynne's name slowly drifted from marquee lights to murmurs of regret. He toured small clubs across Ohio in a worn, thinning suit, singing his heart out to a few dozen distracted, half-drunk patrons. Some nights, he lingered backstage, waiting for a club owner to press $50 into his palm, just enough for a cheap motel and another uncertain tomorrow. Then, on July 13, 1984, under the dim lights of a tiny Oakland stage, as he delivered the final lines of a song that once electrified arenas, his body gave way. He collapsed, hands still wrapped around the microphone. The music faltered. Panic swallowed the room. Philippe Wynne died that night at only 43. The voice that once set concert halls on fire left behind nothing but a haunting silence, echoing with truths never spoken and wounds never healed. Willie Hutch. Willie Hutch, the songwriter they erased. Few people realize he was the mind behind Brothers Gonna Work It Out, the explosive anthem from the 1973 film The Mac, a track that helped define the raw, electric spirit of Motown's street soul. In the 70s, his pen was pure alchemy, shaping R&B hits that poured millions into the label's empire. But by the late 80s, when Motown shifted direction, Willie Hutch vanished. From headlines, from guest lists, from the glittering parties where he once belonged. A colleague remembered the fall of 1987. Willie was invited to a meeting about a new project. When he arrived, his name was gone from the list. No explanation. Just a cold verdict. He's finished. After that, he slipped into silence. Whisper said he managed a small record shop in Dallas, buried in debt because Motown never fully paid his royalties. In 1991, he sold his black Cadillac, the last shining symbol of his glory days, to cover an $18,000 tax bill. Willie Hutch passed away in 2005, and barely a headline marked the loss. And the haunting question lingers behind every note he left behind. How does a genius who made Motown millions get cast aside so cruelly? Minnie Riperton. Minnie Riperton. The night an angel's wings were broken by a merciless disease. You probably remember April 4, 1975, when Minnie stood on the stage of the Midnight Special, singing Lovin' You, with a voice that climbed effortlessly into the fifth octave, leaving the audience breathless at her almost superhuman range. But after that radiant night, her life turned into a chapter of quiet suffering. In January 1976, doctors delivered the unthinkable: terminal breast cancer. In an interview soon after, she fought back tears as she admitted she had 6 months, maybe a year. The diagnosis shattered every plan she had made. She canceled nearly all her tours, keeping only a handful of small shows to help cover treatment costs. Some say that later that year, Minnie sold her wedding ring and most of her jewelry to pay medical bills that had climbed to $60,000. Few people knew she was even asked to sign a waiver promising not to sue her label if she died in the middle of a project. On February 14, 1979, inside a Los Angeles studio, Minnie quietly recorded what would become her final song. When she finished, she collapsed, whispering, "Don't let them forget me." For months later, Minnie Riperton was gone at just 31. The voice that once soared beyond the clouds now lives only on worn vinyl and fading tapes, a haunting reminder that no one outruns fate, no matter how breathtaking their song. Jimmy Ellis. The disco flame that once set America ablaze, fading into a forgotten night. When Disco Inferno exploded in 1976, Jimmy Ellis and the Tramps didn't just top charts, they ignited a movement. "Burn, Baby, Burn" became the battle cry of a generation, the spark that lit dance floors from coast to coast. The single sold over 2 million copies, and for a moment, it felt like the fire would never die. But flames rise fast, and sometimes fall even faster. By July 1979, only 3 weeks after disco began its public collapse, Atlantic Records abruptly canceled the group's contract. One night, Jimmy staggered out of the label's office, drunk and stunned, gripping an envelope that showed his bank balance, $436. Just like that, the roar of arenas was replaced by silence. The man who once commanded thousands now drifted through small clubs, earning a few $100s to sing the same anthem that had once shaken America. On February 14, 1982, he reportedly performed in a worn-down Newark club for fewer than 30 people. After finishing Disco Inferno, he forced a fragile smile and murmured, "Tonight, nobody wants the fire to burn anymore." The spotlight dimmed. The calls stopped. The legend slowly slipped beyond music's memory. Years passed in quiet obscurity until Alzheimer's disease stole even the echoes of his glory. On March 8, 2012, Jimmy Ellis passed away, leaving behind a haunting truth: the flame that once lit up a nation didn't explode or flicker out in scandal. It simply faded, and no one noticed. Candy Staton. Candy Staton, the queen of Southern soul, once brought America to its feet, only to one day be forced to sell her own home to pay off mounting debts. Few could have imagined that the woman who made the nation sway to "Young Hearts Run Free" would spend years living so quietly it felt as if her voice had vanished from history. When the song exploded in 1976, selling over 1 million records, she dazzled beneath the stage lights with a radiant smile. But behind that glow was a heart slowly breaking. As the 1980s dawned, disco fell out of fashion. Record labels shifted their money elsewhere. And almost overnight, Candy disappeared from the major charts. The applause faded. The phone stopped ringing. After her 4th marriage collapsed, financial strain closed in, and she made the painful decision to sell her Atlanta home just to settle her debts. In 1987, a colleague remembered watching her sing gospel in a small church before only a few dozen people. No spotlight, no orchestra, just her voice, and tears she tried to hide, knowing she could no longer afford the band that once stood behind her. That night, she quietly promised herself she would never return to the dark side of show business. Though she later found her way back through gospel music and still lives today, many fans believe the fierce, rebellious fire she once carried was left behind, somewhere beyond the curtain. Thief, Blackfoot, thief, Blackfoot. The star who once topped the charts, and later couldn't afford a motel. There were nights when Jay Blackfoot sat alone in a dim Memphis studio, turning a worn scrap of paper between his fingers, the handwritten lyrics to Taxi, the song that pulled him out of obscurity and into the spotlight. In 1984, it soared into the Billboard R&B Top 5, crowning him a new king of soul. His voice was velvet and fire, and for a moment, the world leaned in to listen. But fame can be fleeting. Within a few short years, the spotlight cooled. By the 90s, Jay had vanished from the big stages, his name slipping down marquees and into memory. He drifted through county fairs and smoke-filled bars, singing to smaller crowds who barely knew the legends standing in front of them. In 1993, he earned just $150 for a show in Arkansas, then slept in the back seat of a truck because even a cheap motel was out of reach. In his final years, he quietly battled lung cancer, turning down most interviews. He didn't want the public to see him fragile. He wanted them to remember the power, not the pain. On November 30, 2011, Jay Blackfoot passed away, leaving behind a voice that once melted the heart of the South and a silence that felt far too easy for the world to accept. Zulema. A name the younger generation barely remembers. When she walked away from faith, hope, and charity to chase a solo career, critics were certain she'd reign as the R&B diva of the 70s. Giving Up was electric, a stunning record that carried her onto the Billboard charts and into the spotlight. For a fleeting moment, the future seemed limitless. And then, she disappeared. After that flash of glory, the calls stopped coming. By the 80s, no label would touch her music. The woman once destined for stardom found herself teaching part-time at a small community center in Tampa, sharing her gift in quiet rooms far from the stage lights. In 1986, someone recognized her in a tiny record shop, gently stacking copies of her own albums onto a discount shelf. They said she only offered a faint, fragile smile, and not a single word. In her final years, she slipped almost entirely from public view. When she passed away in 2013, many young people had never even heard her name. It was as if that voice, once so powerful, so full of promise, had simply faded into silence. Oh, right? A voice chained to addiction. Go back to 1973. Backstage at a small club in Jackson, Mississippi, Wright stands trembling in the dark, a syringe tucked beneath his jacket like a secret he can't outrun. That night he walks into the lights and sings, "That's How Strong My Love Is," his voice raw and ragged, trying to hide the sores climbing his arms. The crowd doesn't see the damage. They just hear a man sounding like he's already halfway to the grave. When the lights fade, OV crumples to the floor, whispering, "I can't break free in the 70s. The spiral tightens. Drugs. Desperation. In 1976, police raid the rundown apartment where he's hiding. They find him unconscious on the floor, a bag of cocaine at his side and a suitcase stuffed with $2,000 in wrinkled bills, the last of his money. After that comes prison. When he gets out, the phone doesn't ring. Friends disappear. His recording opportunities vanish. The industry moves on without him. He has nowhere left to land. In 1980, inside a Memphis rehab ward, his heart gives out. He's 41 years old. In his coat pocket is a list of debts that runs longer than his future ever would. And just like that, the voice that once made millions weep fades into a hollow echo, a haunting reminder of how even the strongest love can't always save the man singing about it. Billy Preston. Billy Preston, the keyboard prodigy who let the music carry him higher than anyone thought possible, until the drugs pulled him under. In 1974, they called him the Fifth Beatle. He stood beside legends, his fingers dancing across the keys for the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, earning millions and electrifying stadiums with a smile that lit up the stage. Paul McCartney once wrapped him in a joyful embrace before a roaring crowd. He was untouchable, golden. But by the 1980s, the applause had faded. The man who once commanded arenas was slipping quietly into addiction, and then into prison. Fans began to ask the same uneasy question: where did Billy Preston go? Why had his name vanished from every major tour? In November 1982, the answer came crashing down. He was arrested in Los Angeles, driving a Mercedes stocked with syringes and narcotics. Headlines branded it one of the most humiliating falls of a soul icon. After prison, the brilliance remained, but dimmed. He wandered from studio to studio, asking for small contracts, playing not for glory but for survival. Addiction had already taken its toll. In his final years, Billy battled severe kidney failure. One studio technician remembered a haunting night. Billy arrived with an 4 still in his arm, his back bent in pain. Yet when he touched the piano, everything else disappeared. He played as if every note were a prayer, one last plea for redemption. In 2006, Billy Preston took his final breath in silence. A genius once celebrated by the world, gone alone, his music echoing long after the applause had died. Leon Ware. Leon Ware, the love songwriter history almost forgot. He was the quiet force behind so many of Marvin Gaye's most timeless love songs, yet his own life unfolded in silence, marked by struggles the audience never saw. When I Want You became a masterpiece in 1976, Leon believed his moment had finally arrived. Instead, the label chose to put only Marvin's name on the cover, leaving Leon in the shadows, as if he had never been there at all. In the 80s, he tried to step into the spotlight with solo albums, but success kept slipping through his fingers. In 1984, he was living off a $3,000 advance, writing jingles for car commercials just to survive. A colleague once recalled seeing Leon backstage at a small fair in Oakland, holding an envelope damp with tears because the payment inside wasn't enough to cover that month's rent. Leon Ware passed away in 2017 after a long illness. And in the cold studios where his melodies once lingered in the air, people still whisper, no one could write love songs that heartbreakingly beautiful, because no one else ever lived them the way he did. Lonnie Liston Smith. The visionary who once sounded like the future, then watched the future move on without him. There was a time when his name felt cosmic. They called him the man who cracked open the universe for jazz funk. Expansions in 1975 didn't just play through speakers, it pulled thousands into orbit, lost in its hypnotic, otherworldly pulse. But fame arrived fast, and it arrived heavy. Lonnie toured relentlessly, city after city, stage after stage, signing contracts he would later confess he barely understood. At some point, he admitted he wasn't even sure why he was still playing. By the late 80s, jazz funk had slipped out of style. Records moved slowly. Labels lost interest. The calls stopped coming. The crowds thinned. What once felt like ascension turned into isolation. Disappointment and exhaustion closed in, and Lonnie sank into a deep depression. A relative recalled that in 1992, he began refusing interviews, often saying he had nothing left to offer the world. In 1994, a studio technician found him sitting for hours at his old Fender Rhodes, hands trembling over the keys, not playing, just hovering there in silence. After that, he nearly disappeared. Now and then, he would surface in small clubs, performing for a few dozen quiet listeners. Today, though he is still alive, many believe he has chosen seclusion, retreating into small, dim rooms, far from the noise, far from the lights, far from the stage that once felt like the center of the universe. David Ruffin. David Ruffin, a once-in-a-generation voice undone by his own pride. There was a night when he stood before a Motown dressing room mirror, slipping a fistful of heroin into his vest pocket, a jagged laugh breaking the silence. They can't replace me. But they did. By 1968, after too many missed shows and too many explosions of ego, the Temptations let him go. Just like that, the voice that once defined an era was suddenly on the outside, looking in. In the years that followed, David drifted like a ghost of his former glory, surfacing in dim, second-rate clubs, chasing echoes of applause that never sounded the same, then vanishing again into the dark. In 1989, he was arrested in Detroit, accused of ties to a drug ring. Whispers swirled that he owed tens of thousands to dangerous men. The legend had become a cautionary tale. Then, on the morning of June 1, 1991, they found him collapsed outside a hospital, wallet empty, white powder still clinging to his hand. The official story read, crack cocaine overdose. But even now, some believe the truth was buried with him, that David Ruffin wasn't just another fallen star, but a warning left on the pavement. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway. The voice that cracked beneath invisible shadows. For a time, the world believed his voice could calm any storm, heal any broken heart. But behind the velvet tone lived a man at war with his own mind, convinced, night after night, that someone was coming for him. By the late 70s, Schizophrenia had tightened its grip, blurring the line between brilliance and terror. In 1978, he fled a recording session in panic, crying out, "They've wired the place to kill me." The room fell silent as those who loved him watched their hero unravel before their eyes. On January 13, 1979, Donnie fell from a 15th-floor window of a Manhattan hotel. The papers called it suicide. Friends insisted he had seemed clear, even hopeful, just hours before. Some still whisper that he didn't jump, that a darker force pulled him into the night. Whatever the truth, the voice that once lifted millions was silenced on the cold pavement below, and the music was never the same again. Gwen Guthrie, the undisputed queen of the dance floor, and the silent illness that stole her final years. Do you remember those electric nights in 1980s New York, when clubs pulsed and erupted at the sound of Gwen Guthrie's voice? Ain't Nothing Goin' On But the Rent didn't just top charts. It crowned her royalty under spinning disco lights. She was fire, rhythm, freedom. But when the spotlight dimmed, few saw the shadows closing in. After 1986, the record deal slowed. Radio moved on. The industry that once celebrated her began chasing a different sound. And as the applause faded, Gwen was left to fight battles no audience could see. In 1992, doctors found a malignant tumor. She told almost no one. She refused to let fans remember her through sympathy instead of strength. By 1994, medical bills piled high. She quietly sold her engagement ring, a symbol of love, just to survive. She left the bright pulse of the city for a small rented apartment in New Jersey. Some nights, neighbors heard her crying in the dark, old cassette tapes playing softly as she whispered, "They've forgotten me." Her body grew frail. The woman who once commanded dance floors could barely recognize herself in the mirror. The queen of rhythm was now fighting simply to breathe. On February 3, 1999, Gwen Guthrie slipped away. And the dance floors that once shook with her voice stood silent, as if the music had never been there at all. They once sang and set millions of hearts on fire. Yet in the end, many carried crushing debt, addiction, illness, and the cold echo of empty rooms where no one knocked. Some died alone on hotel floors. Some slept in broken-down vans. Others held secrets about unseen forces that pushed them toward despair. Whose story breaks your heart the most? Leave their name in the comments. And subscribe to Black Icons Uncovered. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next untold story behind the spotlight.